So we are basically in chapter 12 and 13, but don't read the whole shebang yet, because the Phillips curve and the AIS curve is already a little bit talked about in chapter 12, and we don't do that yet at all. Not yet at all. We do that after the break, the Phillips curve and the AIS curve. What we want to stick with is the so-called IS curve, which we already done, and we add to it today the MP curve and the AD curve. And also, if you read in the book doesn't have the multiplier that we have in our IS curve all the time. So I think in chapter 12 and 13, they just set x equal to 0 to make things a little bit nicer and easier. But since we've done the multiplier already before the mid-semester exam, and because it fits nicely with all the other stuff, it's always here on the slides. But don't get shocked that it looks different to the book. The only difference is we have the multiplier, they set the multiplier x equals 0, the basically multiplier of 1. Where are we? So we had the standard GDP thing here, and that was our goods market equilibrium, where we said everything that is being produced is being either consumed, invested, the government is eating it up, or we send it overseas, minus the imports. The endogenous variables that we had up to now were GDP itself, right? That was one of the variables that we want to explain. Consumption, because we made consumption a function of GDP, remember? If you get higher income, we start consuming more. That makes consumption an endogenous variable. And investment was endogenous because it was driven by the interest rate up. Just because it's a while ago. So if the interest rates go up, investment goes down, right? Because less projects are breaking even. Exogenous variables, so that's variables that we just plugged in. We said this is a certain number, we take it from outside. Were in the past R and all kinds of shocks which were hidden in the variable A. And today the new thing that we want to do is we basically want to endogenize the interest rate. So in the next few weeks, more and more of these variables will be endogenized. Today it's R, after it will be inflation, and then we go to the BP curve, then will be foreign exchange in imports. So we get them all bigger and bigger and bigger to explain more and more variables. So we have the money market equilibrium today. We talk about monetary policy, central banks, and inflation, and the result will be we endogenize R. Money supply and demand. That's a little bit easier if I go straight to the graph. I think it's a bit more interesting. So we want to make a graph where we have the money market, and in the money market we have certain demand for money and supply for money. Let's go straight to the graph, that's a little bit easier. So this is the money market. We plonk on here the nominal interest rate for the time being. And here is money. Now what is money? Money can be either the cash in our wallet or deposit money on our bank account. But here what they are focusing on is basically money that is with the banks and reserves. I think that's the easiest way to think of that one. This is kind of money that the central bank has control over. And the central bank has control over how much cash is being printed, because nobody else is allowed to print. And also the central bank has control over how much electronic money they're creating for banks to hold. Now I have to be a bit careful that I tell you everything that you need to know to understand today's class. But I know that in Econ2022, which you can choose, and in Econ30 there will be hours spent on this stuff. So I don't want to grab ahead too much, otherwise you get bored in the future. So if I'm too short with my explanations, it's your job, just ask, and I'm happy to give you more information if this is insufficient. So we come back to that graph in a second. We talk a little bit more about the interest rate that we have in there. So we have different central banks. Central banks are basically the institutions that are allowed to print money, and they're in charge of creating money and monetary policy. I think that's the easiest way to think of that one. In Australia, it's the so-called Reserve Bank of Australia. So you see that frequently in the news. People say, oh, interest rate goes up or interest rate goes down. And in Australia, the main policy rate is called the so-called cash rate. And currently that's sitting at 1.5%. The same system we've got in the US. In the US, it's the so-called Fed is the central bank, and the federal funds rate there is 2.5%. And in Europe, it's a little bit trickier. The best equivalent to these interest rates in Europe is the so-called EOINA, Euro Overnight Index Average. And currently that is negative 0.37%. Speaking of presentation topics, I think some groups already said negative interest rates. that's also one of the hot topics because it's a bit unusual. So you're living in very, very special times that interest rates are so low. Usually they're much, much higher. And in the past, lots of economists would have put their hand into the fire and say negative interest rates are impossible. But we do have negative interest rates nowadays. So what do all these interest rates have in common? They are all overnight interbank interest rates. That means you can neither invest at an interest rate nor can you borrow money at that interest rate. This is an interest rate especially between banks if they lend money to each other for one single night, and also I can add to it uncollateralized. So it's a little bit risky. Right? There's no collateral. However, the risk is not high because it's just for one night. So you would hope you know if the other bank is still around tomorrow and can repay you. Everybody on board, so that's important. I should have made lots of exclamation marks here too. Overnight interbank interest rate. That is usually the one that the central banks are targeting and fiddling with. So, how can central banks affect this interest rate? Banks have to hold so-called reserves. Now, what are reserves? The basic idea of reserves is twofold. So number one is vault cash, number two it's money in central bank accounts. So if you go to an ATM, you would hope the ATM is not empty, right? Because if you go to the bank, to an ATM or to a counter and you want to withdraw some of your deposits, if you want to get cash out and they don't have enough cash there, it's a huge problem, right? Number one, you're majorly upset. Number two, you spread the word to other people and they get upset too, even though they might not want to pick up money today. Because then if they hear or see in the news that you didn't get money, what would they most likely do? Let's say you hear in the news your local bank didn't pay out its customers today. They were lining up and they didn't have enough cash. What idea might you get? Yes, right. So you start running to the bank and withdraw, and no bank ever has enough cash to pay lots of customers back at the same time. Banks only hold a minimum amount of cash to be able to pay the normal amount of walking in customers. A very simplified and slightly wrong version of that one is to think of it, well, if you put $100 deposits on your bank account, the bank is just putting a little bit of it into the vault and most of it is lending out to other people. That's the main business of a bank. More advanced you will learn it's actually working slightly different. But to get the gist out of that one, that's the story, right? So no bank ever has enough cash in the vault to pay out all its customers. That's totally impossible. But they have to have some cash at least. And banks, if a bank pays another bank, so let's say for example I'm with, let's say Bank A, I don't want to make advertisement for certain banks. So I'm with Bank A and I transfer money to you and you're all with Bank B. Well, somehow that money has to go to Bank B. So Bank B is not giving you additional deposits without getting anything from Bank A. And there's two ways that Bank A now can transfer money over to Bank B. Either they can put all the cash into a truck, drive it over. That of course never happens. The alternative what they can do is all the banks have an account at the central bank, at the RBA. And what Bank A, my bank, is doing then is transferring from their central bank account towards Bank B's central bank account. So banks pay each other via reserve money, via central bank money. And that's the reason why all banks need central bank money, reserves, and vault cash. Vault to pay out cash, reserve money at the central bank to pay other banks. Very important. And when I talked about the interest rate overnight borrowing beforehand, we are talking about borrowing and lending off this central bank reserve money. Cash rate. So the cash rate was in Australia the overnight interest rate between banks, and that's basically the cost if you have too little liquidity on your balance sheet. So if you have too little reserves, then you need to borrow it or get it somehow quick from someone else. And if you borrow it for one night, you have to pay the other bank the cash rate. That's the reason why the cash rate is so important. And that relates to the demand curve that we have seen here beforehand, right? So let's go back to this one. This is the cash rate now. So if it is very, very expensive to borrow, very, very few banks want to borrow cash. And also, they don't necessarily want to hold lots of reserves and cash on their balance sheet because they can lend it out to someone else. Right? Let's say this is, I'm making a ridiculous example, 10%. So if I could earn 10% by lending my reserves to someone else, of course I do it. Right? And that means I personally don't want to hold that much reserves on my balance sheet. And the opposite is here. If the interest rate is very, very low, let's say 0.2%, right? Then it's not really that much worth lending it out to other banks. I rather keep the reserves with me. So I want to have more reserves on my own account, you might say. And then money demand here is high. Makes sense? Even simpler, think of it as the price of money. If money is expensive, few people want to have money, or few banks want to hold money. If money is cheap, lots of bankers want to hold lots of money. Good. Money supply, some textbooks have it vertical, some textbooks have it horizontal. I know that in 3210 and in 2200 we do horizontal, and in fact the RBA, even though they might not draw a horizontal line here, is they do have a fixed cash rate target. Currently it's 1.5%. So they don't say we want to have $5 billion in the Australian economy. They say we want to have the cash rate at 1.5%. So it doesn't matter how much money is in the economy, they're currently targeting here 1.5%. That's the reason why we made it horizontal in this class. Good. Nice. So I explained this one. Why is the cash rate important? Well, the cash rate is influencing the loan rate. That's what they have mortgage rates as well. That's what they have in the news all the time too. So if the cash rate is going up, typically mortgage rates go up too. If the cash rate is going down, typically mortgage rates going down too. Now you might think like, why the heck is that, right? The cash rate is one single night between banks. Why should the mortgage rate be affected by this one? And the answer for that one is, there's several answers. A very, very simple answer, which again is too simple, such that it's wrong. They say, well, banks finance themselves via the cash rate, so they borrow money from other banks. They have to pay the cash rate, and if their borrowing cost is increasing with high cash rates, well, then they charge their customers more money too. It's a cute explanation. However, if you look at the bank's balance sheet, the amount of borrowing between banks is tiny compared to the size of their balance sheet. So that's not really a good explanation why the mortgage rate is affected by this one. A little bit of a better explanation I find is it's increasing the risk for the banks. So if the cash rate is going up and now my customers are transferring money somewhere else and I'm running low on reserves, I have to borrow reserves quickly and I have to pay the high expensive cash rate. That is of course not nice for me, right? So I don't like that risk. How can I limit that risk? Well, either by having more reserves, but that's potentially costly as well, or I simply don't have that many deposit customers. So I'd simply create less deposits and loans and keep my balance sheet and my bank a little bit smaller. Right? So you can say if the cash rate is very high, banks like to stay a little bit smaller. If the cash rate is very low, banks expand massively. And of course, bank expansion means they hand out more mortgages. And if they hand out more mortgages, what's happening to the interest rate? Down, right? As in anything in economics. So if there's more supply of something, the price of it goes down. If the banks supply more mortgages, the price of mortgages goes down. Again, the details you have in future classes, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. For me, important here now is just that you understand that the cash rate is linked to mortgage rates and loan rates. Also, the cash rate is linked to bond rates. So you talked about bond yields and prices in finance. Just a quick reminder. So if the bond price is going up, what happens to the bond yields? Down, right? You're all on board? Good. So just imagine now, let's say I can earn in the interbank market something ridiculous 10%. So the cash rate is going up to 10%. So it would be very profitable to lend reserves to another bank. But let's say I don't have any reserves right now that I could lend to another bank, but I've got a ton of bonds lying around, and they're currently having a yield of 5%. What could you do? You sell the bonds to some other banks, right? You get reserves in, because the banks pay each other with reserves, and now you lend the reserves to another bank at 10%. the fact that you're selling lots of bonds, and other banks are doing that too, what happens to the bond price? Down, bond yield, up. So you can see the bond yields and the cash rates, they're going in the same direction. They affect each other due to these arbitrage opportunities, right? Because you reshuffle your balance sheet, you reshuffle your investment portfolio such that you're happy with the returns on both. Good. And another one is the yield curve. So we talked about short-term interest rates, but the bonds might be long-term, 10-year bonds. So why the heck would that affect long-term interest rates? Also, when we talk later on about investments, so the whole point we talk about interest rates here is because we want to link it up with our IS curve and our real interest rate. That's the direction we are heading. So somehow we have to link the overnight nominal cash rate to long-term real interest rates. And one way to do that one is the yield curve. So this is a yield curve, just a quick reminder. Yield curve means we have here 3-month bonds, 2-year bonds, 5-year bonds, 7-year bonds, 20-year bonds, 30-year bonds. So the duration is getting longer and longer and longer the more we go to the right. And here's the yield, the effective return on that bond. And now I can animate it. And you can see it's jumping around. The main message here out of that one is what you can see here is if the short term is moving, the long term is moving roughly in the same direction. They don't always move one for one, but there's somewhat of a positive correlation here usually, right? So usually if the short-term interest rate here is up, the long-term rate is fairly high too. Now this is very unusual in an inverted yield curve. Now if the interest rates come down, you can see here the short end is being pulled down, and it somewhat pulls the long end down as well. And you've learned in the finance class the different theories why that is the case. The point is all these interest rates are connected. So if the central bank, the RBA, is decreasing the overnight interest rate, it has an impact on the 10-year interest rate as well. They're connected with each other. That's the main point here. So details we do in the other classes. So if you have done finance already, you can be fairly relaxed about that one. And the next one here in red, maybe lots of exclamation marks here too, very important. We assume that in the short run, inflation is sticky. So in the short run, inflation doesn't change very much. Or say it even simpler, prices are somewhat sticky. Right? The prices are not changing much. So if the RBA is pumping more money into the economy tomorrow, or is reducing the cash rate, which is kind of the same thing, it's not that immediately the prices in the shop jump up. So inflation is sticky. And that's important. Because inflation is sticky in the short run, that means that we can keep this one here constant in our mind. Sorry, I just flipped this around. It's a little bit more useful here. So minus inflation on the other side. So this is the interest rate, the nominal interest rate that the central bank can affect on the short run and also for the 20-year bond. This is inflation, which is the constant. So feel free to make a dash above it for the time being. And that means if the central bank is raising the nominal interest rate, automatically the real interest rate goes up too in the short run. And the other way around too. Nominal interest rate down, real rate down, because inflation is sticky. It's constant in the short run. Very, very important assumption. We had noticed the difference to what we learned in the long run. In the long run, we said exactly the opposite. Right? In the long run, we said that the real interest rate is constant and that any change here in the interest rate would affect the inflation rate. Right? So in the long run, the opposite is true. But in the short run, we can keep inflation constant. Good. What else do we have here? How can the RBA affect the cash rate? Again, in 3210, you learn it slightly different, but here we use the simplest version that we can use for this class. We use simple open market operation. Now, have you done open market operations in finance already? No. Good. So what is meant by open market operations? Basically, the RBA buying and selling of bonds. Let's go back into this graph, and we can nice and easily see it. We can also see why people sometimes have a vertical line here. So if the RBA wants the interest rate, the cash rate, to go down from 1.5% to, let's say, 1.25%, how can they do that? If you just look at the graph, if I was going to drop the interest rate down here, what's happening to money supply, to the equivalent amount of money? Gets bigger, right? Now, how can the RBA get more money into the economy? They can just throw it out the window, right? That's so-called helicopter money. Or what's more realistic, open market operation. They go into the market for bonds, and if they want to push money into the economy, they have to buy or sell. Buy bonds, right? Wonderful that somebody had it wrong, because people get it wrong frequently. Students, including myself, because somehow it feels intuitive that you go the other way around. So there's a nice and simple trick that I suggest you should always do in the exam, or always when any kind of these questions come up. And I mentally do it every single time I'm talking about this topic. Did I bring all it? So mentally think bonds, money, and you're the RBA. And now think which way things are going, right? So if you want money into the economy, that means you need to pull bonds out of the economy. If you want to pull money out of the economy, you give bonds into the economy. So if you're selling bonds, you're pulling money out. Make sense? So this is a very, very simple trick that makes it absolutely foolproof. And I know it looks like a kindergarten, but trust me, I've seen plenty of 7 students, so students that get everything right and on the spot easily mixed up and lost points for something stupid like that. Very easy if you just imagine you have the bonds in your hand, which way to go. Good. So what did I say now? If they're buying lots of bonds, they're pumping money into the market. Also, the bond price is going, if the RBA is going into the market, buys lots of bonds, bond price up, bond yield down, right? So it fits nicely with exactly what we're saying here. Bond yield down, interest rates down. Right? So that all works together nicely. Open market operation. Newly created money. So for the RBA, it's very, very easy to create money. Basically, remember that the banks have accounts at the RBA. So what the RBA is simply doing is, if they're buying a bond from a bank, they just type on their computer, okay, $5 million more on their bank account. Done. So the RBA can simply create new reserves and cash. A little bit real data here. So as I said before, you live in very, very special times where interest rate levels and the policy interest rates are exceptionally low. If you look at this, we never had it that low beforehand. Right? So these are not normal times that we have right now. Interest rates used to be much, 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 much higher. So this is the same story for the S. Currently very, very, very low. In the past, much higher interest rates. Look at this, ridiculously, 18%, right? Remember, this is of course a nominal interest rate. So take a guess at that time, high inflation or low inflation? Very high inflation, right? So the real interest rate wouldn't have been that high, but still most likely fairly high real interest rate at that time too. Good. Wonderful. So the central bank can affect the real interest rate because we assume that inflation is sticky. If inflation was fully flexible, this wouldn't work.